in the spring of 1978 at a municipal tax sale in a church basement on the edge of Lacombe, Alberta. A 41-year-old woman named Vivienne Solberg paid $620 for a derelict grain elevator that the town had been trying to unload for the better part of 3 years. The building was a disaster by any reasonable measure. The exterior cladding had gone gray and soft from decades of weather. The lift mechanism inside had seized so badly that the county inspector refused to stand beneath it. The foundation had heaved on the north side, giving the whole structure a lean that locals called the Lacombe tilt and engineers called a liability. Pigeons had colonized the upper third. The lower bins had been used as dumping ground for everything from broken-in equipment to old campaign signs from an election nobody wanted to remember. The listing agent, a tired man named Kowalski from the county office, introduced it the way you introduce something embarrassing at a family gathering. Lot 47, former CNR-affiliated grain handling facility. Structural assessment on file. Opening bid is $600. Nobody moved. $550? A man from a land holding company out of Calgary shifted in his folding chair but didn't raise his hand. $600, Vivienne said. She paid cash. She had a bank draft in her coat pocket that she'd prepared 2 weeks before the sale. Kowalski looked at her over his reading glasses. Sold. $600 to the lady in the back. Her brother-in-law, a practical man named Glenn, who had driven her out from Red Deer that morning, helped her walk through the building after the paperwork was signed. He ducked under a fallen beam near the entrance and stood in the gray light of the main floor, looking up at the pigeons, at the seized lift cables, at the north wall where daylight was coming through gaps in the cladding that had no business being there. Vivienne, what are you going to do with this thing? Fix it, Tatai. It needs everything. Then I'll fix everything. Glenn was a reasonable man who had long since given up arguing with his sister-in-law about anything more complicated than the weather. He put his hands in his pockets, and they drove back to Red Deer in the kind of silence that meant he was still processing. By the following weekend, Lacombe had a story. Vivienne Solberg bought the old grain elevator, the one nobody would touch. Paid $600 for it at the tax sale. $600 for a building that the town had been embarrassed to own for 3 years. The story moved the way stories move in small Alberta towns in 1978, from the co-op hardware to the credit union, from the credit union to the rink canteen, from the rink canteen to the Legion on a Thursday night. And at every stop the story got a little more colorful, because Vivienne Solberg was not the kind of person Lacombe County expected to be buying condemned grain elevators. Let me tell you about Vivienne Solberg. Because what she did with that elevator over the next 14 months only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from. Vivienne was born in 1937 on a quarter section outside Ponoka, the second of 3 daughters of a man named August Solberg, who had come over from Norway in 1921 with $40, a toolbox, and a complete absence of sentiment about physical work. August ran a mixed operation: barley, hay, a few dozen head of Hereford, the way Scandinavian farmers in central Alberta ran mixed operations in that era. Without complaint, without debt, with a deep and abiding suspicion of anyone who wanted him to sign anything. August Solberg did not believe banks were on his side. This was not paranoia. It was a position he had arrived at through careful observation over several decades and found no reason to revise. He paid for everything in cash or not at all. He kept a locked metal box in the back of the linen closet, the kind of money that didn't show up in any account. because August Solberg's trust in institutions extended precisely as far as the threshold of his own property line. He also fixed everything himself, not as a hobby, as a philosophy. Paying a tradesman to do what a person with 2 hands and sufficient patience could do was, to August, a kind of moral failing. His shop was a long, low building behind the house, heated by a wood stove in winter, populated by tools in various states of age and usefulness. Some of those tools had come from Norway. Some had been made by August himself from scrap bar stock on a forge he'd built in 1934. The forge still worked. Everything in that shop still worked. Because a dry August maintained it the way he maintained everything, with the understanding that a tool was only as retired as the person who stopped caring for it. Vivienne was the only one of the 3 daughters who spent serious time in that shop. Her older sister, Berthe, went to Secretarial College in Edmonton. Her younger sister, Karen, married a pharmacist from Camrose and moved south. Vivienne stayed, not because she lacked options. She had been accepted to the nursing program at the University of Alberta in 1955. She had the acceptance letter. She had the residence deposit paid. She had a suitcase that was 2/3 packed. But August had a fall that July. Not a serious fall, medically speaking. A stumble off the granary steps that broke 2 ribs and bruised something in his lower back that the doctor in Ponoka said would take months to settle. Nothing life-threatening. But a man with broken ribs and a bad back cannot run a mixed farm alone, and August had been running it alone since Vivienne's mother passed in 1952. Vivienne unpacked the suitcase. She told herself it was temporary. The nursing program told her she could defer a year. She deferred. The year became 2. 2 became a decade. By the time it became clear that she wasn't going to Edmonton, the clarity of it no longer caused her pain. She had, somewhere in those years, found that she was good at this, not just adequate at it. Genuinely, measurably good. She had August's eye for waste and his patience for problems that required more time than money. She could look at a piece of equipment and see not what it was, but what it would be with the right attention. She rebuilt a seized swather header in the winter of 1961 that 3 different dealers had told August to scrap. She repointed the granary foundation in 1963 with a method she'd read about in an agricultural engineering pamphlet and adapted to materials she had on hand. She kept the books with the same attention to accuracy that August kept the shop. Nothing unaccounted for, nothing rounded up or down, every dollar justified by what it returned. August died in 1969, quietly in his chair by the shop stove, which was exactly where everyone had expected him to go. He left Vivienne, the farm, the equipment, the quarter section, and the metal box in the linen closet, which contained $11,040 in bills of various denominations, organized by size, held with elastic bands. Vivienne was 32 years old. She had no mortgage, no equipment debt, no partners. But it was a dry July and $11,000 in a box that she moved to her own hiding place without informing any institution. Her brother-in-law Glenn offered to help manage the farm. She thanked him and said she'd be in touch. She wasn't in touch. Now, the elevator. When Vivienne looked at that tilted, bird-infested, seized mechanism grain elevator on the edge of Lacombe, she did not see what the county saw. The county saw a liability. She saw a structure. Here is what Vivienne knew that Lacombe didn't. She had been watching that elevator for 2.5 years before the tax sale. She had walked around it in different seasons. She had pressed her hand against the exterior cladding in different places to test for soft spots and found them concentrated in the lower 6 feet on the south and west faces where water ran and pooled. The upper cladding was gray but sound. The interior structure, the heavy timber framing that actually held the building up, was Douglas fir, old-growth Douglas fir. The kind that was cut from British Columbia old-growth forests in the early part of the century, and doesn't exist in commercial quantities anymore. That timber was dry and hard and entirely without rot. Vivienne had checked with an awl she kept in her coat pocket, pressing it into exposed beam faces in 3 separate visits, and the awl had not gone in more than a quarter inch anywhere. The foundation heave on the north side was a drainage problem, not a structural failure. The soil there held water. It had been holding water since the original build, because whoever had graded the site had angled it wrong. Fix the grade, fix the drainage, and the foundation would stabilize. Vivienne had spent an afternoon with a hand level and a string line working out the geometry of it. The lift mechanism was seized but intact. The cables were original. The sheaves were worn but present. The motor that drove the system had been disconnected rather than burned out. Someone had shut it off and walked away, which was not the same as something being broken beyond use. And the building itself was 62 feet tall and had a footprint of 28 by 40 feet on a lot that the town had never properly developed. In 1978, Lacombe was growing. The highway north of town was seeing new commercial traffic. The building sat 3 blocks from the highway, on a corner lot with its own rail spur, which had not seen a train in 15 years, but whose right-of-way was still legally active. Vivienne had not bought a condemned building on impulse. She had spent 2 years figuring out exactly what she was buying and had been waiting for the price to reach a number that made the arithmetic work. That is, what the county never understood about the purchase. They saw a woman bidding on a wreck. They were actually watching a woman execute a plan she'd been building since 1976. Let me tell you about the work, because this is where Vivienne Solberg proved that a clear mind and patient hands are worth more than a contractor's invoice. She started in May of 1978, after the last frost. She rented a small house in Lacombe for $60 a month and drove to the elevator every morning at 7. She started the way August had taught her to start anything, by understanding what she had before touching what she wanted to change. First, she mapped it. Every beam, every post, every connection point. She did this with a notebook and a measuring tape, walking every level of the structure in sequence and writing down dimensions, conditions, observations. The notebook filled up in 2 weeks. She had 4 pages on the foundation alone. The drainage work came first because everything else depended on it. She hired one piece of equipment, a backhoe operator named Perkins from a local groundwork company, for 2 days. She directed him with stakes she'd set herself based on her hand-level survey. The grade around the north and east sides of the building was re-sloped to carry water away from the foundation. A perforated drainage tile was buried at the footing line and run to daylight 40 feet east. Total cost for the drainage work, $230, including the tile and the backfill material she sourced from a road construction crew working on the highway who had excess spoil they wanted rid of. She did not pay for the fill, she asked. There is a difference. The foundation itself she repointed over 3 weekends using a mix she formulated herself, adapted from a technical bulletin she'd requested from the Alberta Research Council. She had contacted them by mail in February, before she'd even bid on the building, explaining what she had and what she needed. They had sent her 12 pages of information at no charge. She had read it 4 times. The cladding came next. The not The lower 6 feet on the south and west faces came off with a pry bar and a claw hammer. Vivienne worked from the bottom up, pulling boards and stacking sound ones for reuse, discarding the ones that had gone spongy all the way through. Of the total linear footage of damaged cladding, she reused 60% of what she removed. The remaining 40% she replaced with rough-cut spruce she bought from a small mill east of Ponoka that sold off-grade lumber at a significant discount to the lumberyard price. The mill owner, a man named Thiessen, initially quoted her his standard retail price. Vivienne showed him the volume she needed and the cash she was prepared to pay that afternoon. Thiessen revised his price. She paid and loaded the lumber into a rented flatbed herself, with Thiessen's son helping, because Thiessen told him to. The lift mechanism took her 6 weekends and a correspondence with the manufacturer's parts department in Ontario. The original motor was a quarter-horse single-phase unit from the mid-1940s. Vivienne found the motor model number on a plate that was still attached to the housing and wrote a letter to the manufacturer asking about compatibility with a replacement unit. They wrote back with a parts list. She ordered what she needed through a wholesale electrical supplier in Red Deer, which required her to present herself as a building contractor, which she did without difficulty because she was one, regardless of whether she had a certificate to that effect. Parts cost for the lift restoration: $87. The pigeons she addressed methodically over 2 weeks in late summer. She sealed every opening above the second level with hardware cloth she cut and stapled herself. She did not poison. She did not trap. She sealed, and the problem resolved itself. The interior she did not restore. She cleared it. Everything that had been stored there over the years. The broken equipment, the old signage, the accumulated debris of a building that had been treated as a convenient dump for 30 years. She sorted into 3 categories. Scrap metal, which she sold to a recycler in Red Deer for $62. Usable material, which she kept or gave to a man who ran a salvage operation out of a yard south of town. Genuine garbage, which she hauled to the landfill over 4 trips in her truck. When she was done clearing, the interior of that elevator was a 62-foot timber-framed space with a working lift mechanism, a sound foundation, dry walls, and natural light coming through windows she'd cleaned for the first time in perhaps 20 years. She stood in the middle of it on a Thursday afternoon in late September of 1979 and thought about what it was. The building was structurally excellent. The location was commercial. The rail spur was a dormant asset that nobody had thought about in 15 years. The ceiling height was extraordinary. The timber framing was beautiful in the way that old, honest construction is beautiful, which is to say, without trying to be. What Vivienne had in mind was not grain storage. She had been watching the business landscape around Lacombe with the same attention she'd given the elevator itself. Small manufacturing was looking for space it couldn't afford in Edmonton and Calgary. A furniture maker she'd spoken to at a trade exhibition in Red Deer in the spring was paying $900 a month for a workshop that was too small and in the wrong part of the city. A metalwork operation had been displaced from its space in Leduc and was operating out of a rented bay that had no loading access. Vivienne put together a rent schedule. She divided the elevator's footprint, the main floor and the usable second level, into 3 separate workshop spaces with shared loading access through the main door and the lift. She priced them at rates that were below anything comparable in Red Deer or Edmonton, but sufficient to produce a monthly income that was real. She put up one notice at the trade exhibition in Red Deer, in the spring of 1980 and sent 3 letters to businesses she had identified as needing what she had. The furniture maker took the largest space within 2 weeks. A woman who made custom canvas and upholstery work took the middle space a month later. The third went to a retired machinist named Veitch, who wanted somewhere to work on restoration projects without his wife asking him when he was going to stop. Vivienne collected the first full month's rent in June of 1980. Total investment to that point, $600 for the building, $411 in materials, $230 for the drainage contractor, $112 in miscellaneous costs. She had tracked to the dollar in the same kind of ledger August had kept, because the ledger told the truth and Vivienne preferred truth to convenience. Total, $1,353. Monthly rent income, $840. She had recovered her full investment before summer was out. Glenn found out about the tenants from the furniture maker, who mentioned it at a trade show. He drove out to Lacombe on a Saturday morning without calling first, which was typical of Glenn, and walked through the elevator with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who is recalculating something fundamental. The furniture maker was working at a bench near the east windows. The canvas woman's sewing machines were running on the second level. Veitch was doing something precise and quiet in the back corner. Glenn stood in the middle of the main floor and looked up at the timber framing above him. You rented it. I did. To 3 people. At the moment, yes. How much did this whole thing cost you? Vivienne told him the number. Glenn took off his cap and held it in both hands. He was a man who built things for a living, site foreman for a construction company out of Red Deer. Practical as concrete. And he was standing in a building that a woman had bought for $600 and turned into a functional commercial property for less than $800 more. And the gap between what he'd expected and what was in front of him was wide enough that he needed a moment. Your father-in-law would have liked this, he said finally. August would have said the windows needed recalking. Glenn laughed. It was an honest laugh. They do, a bit. I know. It's on the list. The word spread through Lacombe the way that kind of word spreads, not as a joke this time, but as a fact, and facts move differently than jokes. Facts require verification. People come to look, and what they saw when they came to look was not what they'd imagined when they'd heard the story of the woman who bought the condemned elevator. They saw something working. By 1982, Vivienne had a waiting list for the third space. She had also been quietly identifying other properties. This was the year the interest rates hit 18%. You know what happened to Alberta in the early 1980s. The energy sector contracted. The farm economy that had expanded on cheap credit during the boom years found itself paying for that expansion at rates that no crop price could cover. Properties that had traded at inflated values 2 years earlier were sitting on the market without buyers, and the buyers who remained had no money, because the banks that had been so eager to lend during the good years were now equally eager not to. Lacombe County lost 9 farms between 1982 and 1986. Not bad farmers, not stupid people. People who had borrowed at the rates the banks offered when the banks were in a lending mood, and were now being asked to maintain those payments when the mood had shifted. Vivienne's expenses did not change. There was nothing to change. The elevator had been bought with cash. The tenants paid rent. The farm in Ponoka she'd kept, leased to a young couple from Rim Bay at a rate that was below market, because the market had gone insane and Vivienne was interested in steady income over maximum extraction. continued to produce consistent revenue in a year when consistency was rarer than gold. She watched the properties come available with the same attention she had watched the elevator in 1975 and 1976. She did not move quickly. She moved when the arithmetic was clear. In the autumn of 1984, a commercial property on the highway north of Lacombe came to the sheriff's sale. A former equipment dealer, a good man named Selkirk, who had expanded his inventory on credit in 1980 and was paying for it now. The property was a 2-bay service building on a half-acre lot highway with frontage that was worth more than the building. The bank had set a reserve of $55,000. A developer from Edmonton came to look at it. A local investor who ran a welding supply operation sent his lawyer to assess it. The reserve was met and exceeded once, then once more, and then the two serious bidders began the kind of escalation that happens when two people with institutional backing decide they want the same thing. Vivienne let it go to $64,000. At $64,500, the Edmonton developer stopped bidding. He had a ceiling. His backers had told him not to exceed $64,000. $65,000, Vivienne said. The room turned. People who had not known she was there found her. People who had known she was there found her again with different eyes. The lawyer across the room looked at his notes. He looked at the developer beside him. He had no instructions above $64,000. $65,000, going once. Vivienne held very still, going twice. She had a certified check in her inside pocket. Sold. She presented the check at the front table, while the room found other things to look at, and then looked back at her. The developer from Edmonton said nothing on his way out. The lawyer packed his briefcase with the careful movements of a man who is not going to discuss what just happened until he's in his car. Glenn was there. He found her in the parking lot after. $65,000 cash, he said. That's right. From the woman who bought a condemned elevator for $600, from the woman who doesn't make payments, Glenn. There's a distinction worth making. He stood there in the October cold with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at her the way a person looks. At something they should have understood a long time ago but didn't, and the weight of that is specific and real. August knew, he said. Knew what? That this is how it works. Keep the costs where they belong. Put the rest away. The properties find you when the people who borrowed to buy them can't hold on. Vivienne looked at the highway frontage she had just purchased. Half an acre of Alberta prairie with 2 service bays and a sign that said nothing anymore because the letters had been removed when Selkirk cleared his equipment out. My father knew that a property you own outright is the only kind that's actually yours. Everything else is a rental arrangement with a bank that gets to set the terms. Glenn nodded. He had owned his house since 1971 and one investment property in Red Deer that he'd bought in 1978 with a 15-year mortgage that had turned variable. He was currently paying 11%. He was not in danger, but he was not comfortable. And the difference between his situation and the woman standing next to him in the parking lot was not talent or intelligence or any quality he could be proud of having missed. "What are you going to do with it?" he said. "The same thing I did with the elevator. Find out what it actually is, and then find the person who needs what it actually is." She rented the service bays to a small engine repair operation within 3 months. The highway frontage she leased to a storage container company for a flat annual fee that required almost nothing of her time. By 1989, Vivienne Solberg owned 4 properties in Lacombe County, all purchased at distressed prices between 1978 and 1986, all producing income, none carrying debt. The grain elevator was still fully occupied. The original furniture maker had been there 11 years and had expanded into a portion of the storage area on the second level after negotiating in good faith with Vivienne about the rent adjustment, which she made reasonable because a good tenant in a functional space is worth more than a higher number on a piece of paper. She managed everything herself, with a ledger that had been updated every month without exception since June of 1980. Not a computer, a ledger. August would have recognized it. In 1991, a magazine that covered small business in Western Canada sent a journalist to write about her. The journalist was a young woman from Calgary who had driven up expecting something modest and was standing in the elevator that afternoon, looking at the tenants, at the timber framing. At the corner, Vivienne had converted into an office with 2 filing cabinets and a desk lamp and a window that looked out at the rail spur that was still, technically, active. Can I ask how much you've spent on all of this, total, since 1978? Vivienne opened the ledger to a page near the back and told her the number. The journalist wrote it down and then looked at it on her notepad for a long moment. And what are the properties worth now? What they're worth and what I paid for them are 2 different questions. I don't think about what they're worth. I think about what they produce. The journalist wrote that down too. The article ran in March. Vivienne did not read it until someone sent her a copy in the mail. She put it in the filing cabinet under the year because it embarrassed her slightly to be written about for doing arithmetic. Veitch, the retired machinist who had been in the back corner of the elevator since 1980, was still there in 1991. He was 73 years old and spent 3 mornings a week working on a 1938 McCulloch chainsaw that he had decided to restore to running condition on no particular deadline. He and Vivienne had developed the habit of drinking tea at the small table near his workbench on Wednesday mornings before the other tenants arrived, talking about nothing consequential. These were, Vivienne understood, the best conversations of her week. One Wednesday in April of that year, Veitch put down his tea and looked at the space around them, the timber framing, the lift cable that still ran clean after his help. In 1979, the windows, the tool arrangements of 3 people who used this space as though it mattered. You know what you did, he said. I fixed a building. You did more than fix it. You saw what it was for before anyone else did, including the people who owned it. Vivienne thought about that. My father had a saying, not an original one. I think he heard it from his own father in Norway. He said that a thing is not finished when it's built. It's finished when it finds the person who understands what it's for. Veitch picked up his tea. That elevator was waiting for you. The elevator was waiting for anyone who could see it clearly. I just happened to be the one looking. She paused. Most people look at a distressed property and see the distress. I look at the frame. The frame is what the thing actually is. Everything else is a repair problem. In 2001, the Lacombe Chamber of Commerce invited Vivienne to speak at their annual business dinner. She was 63 years old and had never done anything of the kind. Her niece, Glenn's daughter, Petra, who had spent summers in Lacombe helping Vivienne with the properties since she was a teenager, and now managed day-to-day operations while Vivienne wound down her direct involvement, convinced her that she should go. Vivienne stood at the microphone with one index card. She looked at it once, then folded it and put it in her pocket. People have asked me for 20 years how I built a property portfolio starting with $600. That is not the right question. The right question is why everyone else let the same buildings sit until the taxman took them. She paused. I didn't do anything unusual. I looked at what was available. I looked at what it actually was, separate from what people had decided it was. I found the cheapest path between what existed and what was needed. That is not a skill. That is arithmetic. She paused again. My father taught me that a building is only as expensive as the problem it solves. If the problem costs $1,350 to solve, then $65,000 is not a better building. It's a more expensive mistake. She looked at the room. I bought 4 properties in Lacombe County for less than $80,000 total. I saved that money because my first building cost me $1,300 instead of $80,000. Because I did the drainage work with a hand level and a letter to the Alberta Research Council. Because I sourced lumber from a mill in Ponoka instead of a lumber yard in Red Deer. Because I never made a payment on anything. People looked at my buildings and saw problems. I looked at their payments and saw the same thing. She stepped back from the microphone. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not. Glenn was in the audience. He was 67 years old and had sold the investment property in Red Deer in 1989 to pay down debt from a contracting business that had contracted more than he'd anticipated. He was comfortable now. He had done all right, but he was sitting in a chair listening to a woman explain in plain language what he had been learning the slow way for 30 years. And the plainness of it was its own kind of instruction. He found her in the parking lot after. $1,353, he said. $1,353. I paid $900 a month for 10 years on a property in Red Deer that I eventually sold for what I owed on it. I know. He was quiet, but it was a dry July. The October air was cold and the streetlights were on, and the grain elevator was visible from where they were standing, lit up from inside because Petra had left the lights on after a tenant meeting that afternoon. It was never about the buildings, he said. No. It was about not having anyone on the other end of a phone call who could change the terms. Vivienne looked at the elevator. The old Douglas fir framing was in there. Still sound. Still dry. The lift was still running. The tenants had changed over the years. The canvas woman had retired in 1994. The furniture maker had bought his own building outside town in 1997. But there was always someone who needed what the space actually was. My father understood something that takes most people a lifetime to learn, she said. That freedom isn't complicated. It's just expensive in the short term and cheap forever after. Debt is the opposite. Cheap in the short term and expensive forever after. The question is, which kind of expensive you can live with? Glenn put his cap back on. He'd known this, somewhere beneath everything. He just hadn't heard it stated that plainly by someone who had proven it with the actual arithmetic. August raised a hell of a businesswoman, Vivienne. August raised someone who paid attention and kept a ledger. The business part followed from that. She started her truck. What do you see when you look at a gray and tilted building at a tax sale that nobody wants? Most people see the end of something, a liability, an embarrassment on a county ledger. The auctioneer saw a problem he wanted off his list. The developer from Calgary saw a number that didn't work at any price. The town saw an eyesore on a corner lot that had been an eyesore for 3 years and would probably be an eyesore for 3 more. Vivienne Solberg saw Douglas fir old-growth framing that nobody was making anymore. She saw a drainage problem with a solution. She saw a rail spur that was dormant but not dead. She saw a lift mechanism that was seized but intact. She saw her father's notebook, her father's hand level, her father's understanding that the distance between what a thing appeared to be and what it actually was could be measured. Not assumed, but measured. By someone patient enough to do the measuring. She saw $1,353 of work and a property that would return that investment before summer was out. Everyone else saw a condemned building. That is the distance between someone who prices things on appearance and someone who prices things on structure. The appearance can be fixed for less than you'd imagine. The structure is what it is and always was, and the people who walked away from it left that value sitting there, waiting for the first person who knew how to look. Vivienne Solberg knew how to look, and when they finally saw what she'd built, not just the elevator, not just the tenants and the rent and the working lift, but the 4 paid-for properties, the undisturbed ledger, the cashier's check in the pocket at the sheriff's sale, while the institutional money stood with its notes and its ceilings and its terms, they understood what she had known. From the morning. She walked through that building with an awl in her pocket and a notebook under her arm. A building doesn't need to be new. It doesn't need to be clean. It doesn't need to impress anyone at the Chamber of Commerce or look right from the highway. It needs to stand. It needs to be paid for. And it needs to be found by someone who understands that the most expensive property in the county is not the one that costs the most to buy. It's the one you're still making payments on when the one next door goes to the sheriff's sale. $620. A woman with an awl and a hand level. August Solberg's ledger. The building nobody wanted. In the hands of the woman nobody had thought to ask. Until they saw what she built inside it.